Welcome to Famous People You've Never Heard of, the podcast brought to you by Adelphi Theatre Company. Each episode is devoted to the discovery of someone once well-renowned and now no longer recognised. We've made it our mission to try to keep the stars of yesterday burning bright and to remember those people in danger of being lost to history. If you enjoy our podcast, do subscribe via your provider so that we'll be a little more visible and you'll never miss an episode. I'm Lottie Walker, and it's my pleasure to spend some time with all these wonderful people. I hope you enjoy meeting them too.
So today in our Zoom room, we are delighted to welcome the wonderful Dr. Mary Shannon from Roehampton University, talking to us about 18th century performer Billy Waters. So Mary, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lottie. Thank you for having me on the programme.
Lovely to have you here. Now tell me, who was Billy Waters?
Well, that's actually not a straightforward question to answer. Billy Waters is both the name of a real person, a real historical person who lived and died 200 years ago. But Billy Waters is also the name of a fictionalised character and a sort of stage persona for the real man, Waters, but also a name that he was remembered by. But he was born William Waters in New York. He was an African American. He was born roughly about the same time as the birth of the new American Republic, so around 1776. And his early life is very much in obscurity, but he arrives in London and becomes a famous street performer, a famous busker, and a famous character in popular culture. And his image, descriptions of him, circulate around all sorts of plays, stories, prints, caricatures, from the Regency period all the way up until the Victorian period. He's not very well known now. He's becoming more well known because it's the bicentenary of his death. There's an early day motion being recorded in Parliament, remembering him, and various projects going on. And I'm writing a biography of him for Yale University Press. He has slipped into obscurity. In the 19th century, you could say the name Billy Waters and people would have a cluster of ideas about what that name meant and who that person was. And nowadays, it's not a name that's at the tip of everyone's tongue. So he was very well known in his day and deserves to be more well known now. His portrait is in the National Maritime Museum. It's very small. It's a lovely portrait. I'd encourage you to go and see it. It's on display in the Atlantic Galleries. It's attributed to Sir David Wilkie, but we don't know for certain that that was the artist. And in fact, we don't know for certain that it was even Waters, although it probably was Waters. And let me tell you why. Because Billy Waters, William Waters, I should say, born in America, he finds his way into the British Navy, and he's invalided out of the British Navy after a terrible accident when he breaks both his legs and has to have one amputated. So a terribly traumatic, horrible, horrendous experience for him. I mean, the realities of surgery in 1812, which is when he suffers this accident, means that, amputation is done without anesthetic. It's done without modern cleanliness. It's a horrible thing. But it means that he survives. So the impact of this, it's not just physical and mental, because he now can't stay in the Navy. He's invalided out. He's given a small pension. But how on earth does a black man with a disability, marooned in Britain, how does he now survive and feed a family on a tiny pension? The answer Waters comes up with is an amazing one. He devises an incredible street performance. He decides that his best way of supplementing his income is to use his musical ability and his knowledge of dancing to grab the attention of the passerby in London. So he creates this most incredible performance where he wears an extravagant costume featuring a large hat with feathers, a sailor jacket, and he plays the fiddle, he dances, and he sings all at the same time. And this is with a wooden prosthetic leg. Amazing. The reason we don't know for certain that the portrait in the National Maritime Museum is of him is because that portrait does not show anything of the costume for which he becomes famous. But it's this costume that grabs the attention not just of passers-by, but of writers, artists, ultimately playwrights, and this drives his fame. It's this amazing creative performance that he creates, which then is picked up and appropriated for their own ends by these artists and writers, all of whom are, of course, white.
But there must have been, at the time, hundreds of buskers out on the streets of London. It's a very common way of earning a living. So did he stand out just because he was black, or was it the costume, or what was it about him that actually sparked the interest?
It's a very good question, Lottie, and I think the answer is it's a combination of all of those things. It wasn't unusual, as you say, to see street performers, people we would now call buskers, on the streets of London in the early 1800s. We're talking about the period during and after the Napoleonic Wars. So there are a lot of people suffering from the economic challenges that are caused by war. You get a lot of demobilized soldiers and sailors who have no other means of earning an income, especially if they've been disabled in the war. A lot of people whose income has dropped. There's a huge amount of economic turmoil in Europe, as you could well imagine, during this war and post-war period. So in short, poverty is a huge problem in London, and a lot of people find the answer to the question, how on earth am I going to feed myself and my family? They find that answer by begging or performing on the street or selling small items on the street, anything that they can do to scratch a living. So it's not unusual, as you say, to see street performers, what we would now say, busking on the street. It's also not that unusual to see disabled veterans on the street, and it's not unusual to see Black disabled veterans on the street, because the reality of the Napoleonic and the American wars meant that a lot of Black loyalists, ex-enslaved Americans, fled to Britain looking for a better life during the Napoleonic Wars after the American War of Independence. A large percentage of the British Navy was made up of Black sailors. So that wasn't unusual. But what made Waters stand out was he brought all of this together. He brought together ideas of the heroic Jack Tar, the jolly sailor, the exotic Black man, the happy stage Black caricature of the sort of jolly African, and the skill required to dance essentially what was probably a version of the hornpipe on a wooden leg. In that mix, he threw in there influences from the culture he was familiar with, so elements of Black street dance, street performance that he probably learnt and was influenced by during his childhood in New York. So this is an incredibly potent combination of lots of different influences, lots of ideas from around the transatlantic world, which he brings together and does so in a really unique and eye-catching way. Douglas Jerrold, for example, who was a friend of Charles Dickens, says, whoever danced as Billy Waters danced, Waters was a genius. And that word genius, I think, is really interesting because that's the respect being offered from one creative worker, who was himself a playwright, to another. And it shows the impact that Waters had in his performances as he played and sang and danced on the Strand, which was a hugely important street in London and gave him a really prominent position. He was really visible. That was the other reason why he stood out. He picked a really good spot, a spot on a main thoroughfare between the East and the city, the financial powerhouse, and the West, the wealthy houses of the rich. Not only that, but he picked a spot in the heart of what was beginning to emerge as the modern West End. Still a little bit early to use that term, but this was the theatre district, and he picks his pitch outside the Adelphi Theatre. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the stereotypes and caricatures and cultural ideas by which he would be judged and within which he would be seen. And my feeling is that he made the most of them. He took the materials that he was given and made a name for himself by slightly playing to stereotypes and slightly subverting them. I think he was a very clever man.
So was the result of all this that he lived in the lap of luxury?
Ah, if only, Lottie, if only. Unfortunately, this story is a tragic one. There Waters is, on the Strand, in London, performing day in, day out, evening in, evening out, earning money from the theatregoers who are going in and out of the Adelphi Theatre. And his fame is growing, which is good news for him. But then he gets featured in an illustration to a hugely popular book. And the book is called Life in London. It's not one we read now, but it was a huge hit in the 1820s. It's published in 1820. That's when it starts being published anyway, in serial form. And it's written by an Irish sporting journalist called Pierce Egan and illustrated by the Cruikshank brothers, Robert and George Cruikshank. George Cruikshank might ring a bell. He goes on to illustrate some of Charles Dickens's novels. The reason these illustrations are so important is because one of them features Billy Waters. And this book is such a hit. It's huge. People want to dress up as the main characters. You can buy tea trays with pictures. All the young people want to speak in the kind of slang that the characters use. It's mega. People are queuing up to buy it. They can't hand colour the pictures fast enough to meet demand for this book. This is the beginning of that kind of fan merchandise commercialization of kind of popular hits. But it's all happening already in the 1820s. So, seems like a really good thing for Waters, you would think. But unfortunately not. What happens next is, like every popular book, an enterprising dramatist comes along and decides to adapt it for the stage. And the particular dramatist in this case is a man called William Moncrief. And he creates a play based on the text of Life in London, sure, but probably more of the illustrations. And his play is called Tom and Jerry, which is the name of the two main characters in the story. These are two wealthy young men traveling around London, exploring all the boozing dens, the high life. They're living it up and living it large, to use a modern term. There's all booze and girls and gambling and that kind of stuff. The play has a scene in which Billy Waters appears as a fictional character. Again, seems like perhaps quite a good thing for Waters. Publicity, exposure, that sort of thing. Except there are two problems with this scene. Problem number one is that the character is played not by Waters himself, not by another black performer, but by a white actor. His stage name was Senior Paolo in blackface. That's problem number one. Problem number two, the scene depicts Billy Waters as a sort of lovable rogue, the king of the beggars, who is bossing around the other beggars. And notice they're beggars. They're not street performers, street professionals. The street people of London are being depicted just as beggars. And they're not just being depicted as beggars, they're being depicted as, in their words then, cadgers. So people who don't really need help and charity and largesse from the middle class Londoner, but are actually having a very jolly time of it, don't you know? The scene depicts them very well off in terms of material comforts. They eat well. Waters calls for turkey with sausages. He berates the landlord of the tavern that they're all in for not giving him good enough food. They talk about having port and Madeira. It seems like Waters is living a materially well-off life. Sure, in a tavern in St Giles, which is the poor slum rookery area of London, But nevertheless, he's doing okay. In fact, in this scene, he's shown as doing so well that he laughs at the Londoners who give him bits of broken food to eat as a gesture of kindness. He laughs at the fact that all these cadgers can fool Londoners into giving them charity and help. So he's not depicted as a professional performer using his skill to legitimately earn money, but as the king of the beggars, a chancer, a rogue, a cadger, benevolently attractive, and pretty well off. This is a problem. It's the beginnings of what becomes a Victorian narrative about the deserving and the undeserving poor. So the effect is that all the people streaming out of the Adelphi, having seen Billy Waters depicted on stage as this well-off, laughing, rogue figure, when they see William Waters, the real Billy Waters, performing outside the theatre, well, why should they give him money? He's fine, isn't he? He doesn't need their support. In fact, not only that, he's laughing at them privately, so they really shouldn't give him any money, should they? In effect, what happens is his income drops off. He's got a wife and 2 children to feed. This is a complete disaster. He has to pawn his fiddle. He gets very unwell, and he dies in a workhouse, supposedly, and this is the story, cursing the play Tom and Jerry with his very last breath. So poor Waters creates an incredible performance which makes him famous, but that very fame ends up destroying him.
That is so, so sad.
It is, and it's a symptom, I suppose, of his great vulnerability and his great precarity as a Black disabled street performer. This was a very challenging position in which to be in Regency London. And he came up against the developing might of the West End theatre world, and he could not compete. There was no copyright law to protect him.
Well, it's a shame, really, that Moncrief didn't actually offer him a cut of the proceeds, wasn't it?
You would think that apparently the play didn't make much money from Moncrief either, who also dies in poverty. So yes, he gets his just desserts, but the Adelphi Theatre does very nicely out of it, and it makes stars of all the main players. But nevertheless, it remains true that the original creator of Billy Waters, the character, the original person who had the idea and created something that people felt was well worth appropriating and, well, stealing, I suppose, effectively, that person was William Waters. That person was the original Billy Waters. And that skill and creativity and resilience in the face of so many challenges should be celebrated and remembered and recognized, even though his life was too short and ultimately very tragic.
And was what happened to him ultimately, was that the fate of most Black performers in the era?
That's a more complex question. Broadly speaking, his story certainly reveals that life as a Black performer in Victorian London, it was a challenging one, because Waters is seen by white observers as in these modes of kind of exotic, other comic stage Black stereotype, the jolly Black sailor. He had to conform to all sorts of racialized caricature stereotypes in order to fit what the white members of his London audience would have expected him to be like. His story does show that he also managed to, within that fine space for skill and creativity, and was given a great deal of recognition by people like Douglas Jerrold, who calls him a genius, by other commentators who notice this skill. There were some other Black performers in London. Their stories are very different. So we might think of George Bridgetower, who was a violinist who was sponsored by the Prince Regent, studied music at Cambridge, had a very different experience to Waters, largely because Bridgetower was seen as being of a different class to Waters. Bridgetower's father famously described himself as an African prince. Bristol had access to much more privileged circles than Waters did, and class is always an important factor in Regency London. And we might think of the great Shakespearean actor Ira Aldridge, another African American from New York, the generation after Waters, effectively, who arrives in London and takes on Shakespearean roles.
First black man to play Othello, I believe.
Yes, Othello, but other major roles too. He does not limit himself to black character roles. So this is a very different experience to Waters. Ira Aldridge gets to be on stage. Waters never gets to do that. It's awful to think of people coming out of that theatre, even imagining that they had seen the real Waters. But then they're looking at the real busker and refusing to give him their money.
And what happened to his wife and children?
We don't know, but it would have been a very challenging life for them after he'd been in the workhouse. To lose their breadwinner in this period, that's a huge problem. And suddenly his wife is left with 2 children to look after and no breadwinner. His pension stops with his death. So she has no continued means of support. Whether she remarried, whether she managed to find work herself, whether the children would have been able to help, all of that is unknown. But women in this period were extremely resourceful when they were left without a breadwinner. We know there's some working class autobiographies, most of whom were written slightly after the 1820s, but nevertheless, we know that from these autobiographies that the death of a father was actually relatively common in lower class households. So let's hope that William Waters' wife was as resourceful as Waters was. What's fascinating though is Waters' street performance. One of the many things it did was it opened up a space where a black performer could be valued as a performer, not as an exotic exhibition, not as a commodity to be bought and sold, but as a performer, a skilled, creative worker in their own right. And he is a window into a transatlantic black performance culture. And although a lot of these possibilities for black performers were shut down by the 1830s because of the rise of blackface minstrelsy, there is this moment where Waters shows other ways of doing things. And he is remembered all the way up until the 1880s. And that memory of Waters, the performer, presents a challenge to the minstrelsy way of viewing and thinking about Black Victorians, I think. So there were figurines of Waters, there were stories about Waters in periodicals all the way up to the 1880s. Right up to then, you could make a reference to Billy Waters, the London fiddler, and expect your readers to remember who he was, or to at least have some vague memory of something they might have read in childhood or could have been familiar with. Although his life is cut short, he dies in his mid-40s, he lives these multiple afterlives and is remembered for several decades. And now, of course, is coming to attention once more, which is fantastic.
And do you think his story is relevant today? Do you think he still matters?
Absolutely, because he reveals a London that is very different, perhaps, to that traditional costume drama view of Regency London. He gives us access to seeing a much more diverse London, to recognising that this was a multicultural international metropolis. And though the Black population of London was relatively small, perhaps about 10,000 people out of a city of about 1 million, that's still a relatively significant number and doesn't really often factor into our thinking about the era of Jane Austen and the boyhood of Charles Dickens. As well, it's not just about what Waters shows us about his world. Waters himself is a fascinating figure and a figure of great creativity and energy, a different way of thinking about Regency culture, the canonical novels, the major plays, the fascination with Shakespeare in that period. Waters is part of popular culture. the sort of things that people like to read or talk about or see at the theatre. But in fact, what Waters proved people wanted to do was to watch good street performance and to be entertained by the skill of it and razzmatazz of it. And he gave people that. And that tells us something important, I think, about Regency London and the connections between what people enjoy today and what people wanted to see then. Isn't it popular culture that tells us so much about life and times? And that's why it's so important to study it, to study both its downsides, but then also the counterparts, like Waters, who is performing on his own terms as well. This man was an experienced professional in the Navy. By the time he gets to London, he's probably in his mid-30s. This is somebody who knows what he's doing. And that's another side, I think, of the history of Black people in Britain, which needs to be emphasised, that he was entrepreneurial and had agency and was not seeing himself as just a commodity or someone to be owned by other people or pushed and pulled by historical circumstance. He was trying to find purpose and control and personal agency in a world where so many forces were trying to remove that from somebody who was Black and disabled. Unfortunately, all we have now left are the images and the written accounts. In the case of Waters, given that the period in which he lived, those images are reflected through layers of stereotype and caricature and racialized language. It's very hard to get a sense of who the real historical person was and how they would have been looked at and how they would have seen things themselves. But I think we can look for the evidence, we can find it, and we can try and recreate in our minds that skill and that performance.
Thank you so much for that insight into his life.
If you want to find out more about William Waters the man and Billy Waters the character, my biography of Billy Waters is coming out with Yale University Press at the beginning of next year. And it's going to recreate his life so far as we know it and think about the connection between his life and the character he created, the performances he created. So please do look out for that.
Certainly will. So it's really lovely to speak to you. Thank you so much.
This research has been very kindly funded by the Leverhulme Trust and the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. So I must acknowledge their support.
Thanks so much, Mary. Lovely to see you.
Pleasure, Lottie. Thank you very much for having me on.
To Mary Shannon. Do look on the show notes for further reading materials. And now, here's our last word, this time from the lovely Charlotte Campbell, who is a modern-day busker on the streets of London.
Hello, my name's Charlotte Campbell and I have been busking on the streets of London since about 2012. And it's an honour, really, to be part of London's busking scene because there's so much history surrounding busking, and busking as an art form in this city dates back to the 1800s and beyond, really. So it feels like you're sort of part of history and you're part of something and you're carrying on an age-old tradition by continuing to busk and street perform to this day. It is a very unique way of performing. It's quite vulnerable and raw because you are right up close with the audience members, and the audience members are not expecting to see a performance necessarily that day. They didn't come for a performance. They might be just passing by and getting a sort of surprise gig or a surprise performance. So there is a sense of achievement in that because street performers really build something from nothing. They take what is just a street and they make it into a stage by enticing the audience to stop and listen to them. So there's something very, very special about it. And it's a shared experience between the performer and the audience member that is very rare. And I don't get that from many other types of performances, gigs or concerts, really. Street performing is got something special about it. And I think that it's probably been the same for many buskers over the many, many years that busking's gone on, that sense of achievement of building something from nothing, making a street into a stage. But a few things have moved on, like technology has moved on a little, because obviously in London, people are carrying less and less cash. And for buskers, that's a disaster. But I know a lot of buskers who now carry card readers, which was not really an option back in the 1800s. But it has moved on a little bit in that terms of technology. But the act of listening and giving and leaving a tip as a thank you for the performance is just the same. It's just obviously changed and grown as the world moves on. And for me, it's really changed my relationship with London, because the London streets have become my stage. So it feels like it's a big part of my identity. And I think a lot of buskers probably feel that way, that city they busk in has become part of who they are. And who they are has become part of the city, really, because buskers are the soundtrack to a city. And I'm just honoured to be part of the sound of London.
When I lay beside you next morning, feel no fear beyond insane. Just in your eyes.
Thank you for listening. You can find further information about our guests and the people we've been speaking about on the show notes. We do hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and if you have, please give us a review online and subscribe via your provider. It really does make a difference. If you like what we do and would like to help us in our work and to keep the podcast going, you might like to consider becoming a patron. It's really easy to do. Just go to patreon.com/bluefiretheatre. Or, if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so on our website, bluefiretheatre.co.uk, or buy us a coffee at ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/bluefiretheatre. Even the smallest donation helps us take our shows on the road and keep the lights on in the studio. We really appreciate and are so grateful for all your support. And finally, don't forget to follow us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Look for Blue Fire Theatre Company on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.